Carl Linnaeus, Naming the Natural World. In the gardens and forests of 18th century Sweden, a young boy wandered among the flowers, fascinated by their colors, their shapes, the way they grew and bloomed and faded with the seasons. His father was a pastor with a love of gardening, and he passed that love to his son, a boy named Carl, who would grow up to bring order to all the living world. Carl Linnaeus was born in 1707, in a time when the natural world was overwhelming in its diversity. European explorers were returning from distant lands with specimens of plants and animals no one had ever seen before. Naturalists had cabinets full of curiosities, but no consistent way to organize or name them. The same plant might have different names in different countries, or even in different books. Communication between scientists was difficult, and knowledge was scattered and confused. Young Carl felt the call of nature deeply. Despite his father's hope that he would enter the clergy, Carl's passion drew him to medicine and botany. He enrolled at Uppsala University, where he soon became known for his keen observations and his burning desire to understand the patterns beneath the apparent chaos of nature. Linnaeus believed that nature had an order, a divine structure that humans could discover and understand. He set himself an ambitious task: to catalogue and classify all living things, to give them names that would be recognized everywhere, by everyone. It was an enormous undertaking, but Linnaeus approached it with systematic determination and genuine wonder. His breakthrough came in understanding how to classify plants based on their reproductive structures, their flowers and stamens and pistils. This might seem like a simple idea now, but in Linnaeus's time, it was revolutionary. It provided a consistent basis for grouping plants, a foundation on which to build a comprehensive system. But Linnaeus's greatest contribution was even more fundamental. He created a simple, elegant way of naming living things that we still use today. Before Linnaeus, the names of organisms were often long, descriptive phrases in Latin. A plant might be called Physalis amno ramosocime ramus angulosus glabris folius dentoserratus, which told you something about the plant, but was impossibly cumbersome to use. Linnaeus introduced binomial nomenclature, a system of two names. Each organism would have a genus name, shared with its close relatives, and a species name, unique to that particular type of organism. Together, these two names would identify any living thing precisely and concisely. The human being became Homo sapiens. The common daisy became Bellus perennis. Suddenly, scientists anywhere in the world could communicate clearly about exactly which organism they were discussing. In 1735, Linnaeus published the first edition of his masterwork, Systema Naturae, or System of Nature. It was just 12 pages long at first, a slim volume that outlined his classification of all known organisms into a nested hierarchy: kingdoms, classes, orders, genera, and species. But this was just the beginning. Throughout his life, Linnaeus would expand and refine this system, publishing edition after edition, each more comprehensive than the last. Linnaeus traveled too, though not as widely as some naturalists. He explored the Swedish countryside, making careful observations of everything he encountered. He sent his students, whom he called his apostles, to distant corners of the world to collect specimens and bring back knowledge. And always, he worked to fit each new discovery into his growing system, finding its proper place in the order of nature. There was something almost meditative in Linnaeus's work. Each plant, each insect, each bird had to be carefully observed, its characteristics noted, its relationships to other organisms considered. He worked with patience and precision, understanding that he was creating something that would outlast him, a framework that future naturalists would use and build upon. Linnaeus's home, his garden, became a kind of living library. He cultivated plants from around the world, observing them through the seasons, noting when each species bloomed, how it grew, what conditions it preferred. His students would gather there, learning not just facts but a way of seeing, a disciplined attention to the details and patterns of the natural world. The impact of Linnaeus's work cannot be overstated. He gave science a common language for discussing life. When later naturalists, including Charles Darwin, would develop theories about how species change over time, they could build on the organizational framework Linnaeus had created. When ecologists would study the relationships between organisms, they would use Linnaean names to communicate precisely about what they had observed. Linnaeus lived until 1778, long enough to see his system adopted throughout Europe and beyond. He was celebrated in his lifetime, granted nobility, and honored by scientific societies. But perhaps his greatest satisfaction came simply from the work itself, from the slow, careful process of observing and naming and ordering, of helping humanity understand its place in the vast diversity of life. As we rest, we can imagine Linnaeus in his garden, moving quietly among the plants, notebook in hand, pausing to examine a flower, to note its structure, to consider its name. We can feel the peace that comes from patient observation, from seeking to understand rather than to judge, from finding order in complexity. And we can be grateful for this gentle Swede who taught us how to speak about the living world, who showed us that beneath nature's overwhelming diversity lies a comprehensible, beautiful order. The foundation has been laid. Knowledge can spread through printed words. The natural world has been given names and order. Now the stage is set for the discoveries that will follow, each building on these fundamental gifts: the gift of shared knowledge and the gift of organized understanding. The invisible forces had been revealed, understood, and harnessed. Electricity flowed through wires and powered machines. The modern world was being born, built on the foundation of mathematical laws and practical inventions, of theoretical understanding and engineering skill. The age of power had begun. Rewriting the heavens. Galileo Galilei, the courage to look up. In the cool evening air of Renaissance Italy, a man stood on a rooftop, pointing a curious tube toward the night sky. The year was 1609, and Galileo Galilei was about to see what no human eye had ever witnessed. Through his improved telescope, the heavens would reveal secrets that had been hidden since the beginning of time, and nothing would ever be quite the same again. Galileo was born in 1564 in Pisa, the same year that Michelangelo died and Shakespeare was born. It was a time of extraordinary cultural flowering, when art and music and ideas were transforming Europe. Galileo's father was a musician and mathematician, a man who taught his son to question authority and to trust in careful observation and reason. These lessons would shape everything Galileo would become. As a young man, Galileo was supposed to study medicine, following his father's wishes. But he found himself drawn instead to mathematics and natural philosophy. There was something about the precision of numbers, the elegance of geometric proof, that called to him. He began to make a name for himself with his observations and experiments, his willingness to test ideas rather than simply accept what ancient authorities had written. The world Galileo inherited was one dominated by the ideas of Aristotle and Ptolemy, ancient thinkers whose words had become almost sacred. They taught that the Earth stood still at the center of the universe, with the sun, moon, planets, and stars revolving around it in perfect circles. The heavens were thought to be perfect and unchanging, fundamentally different from the corrupt and changing Earth. To question these ideas was not just scientific dissent. It was seen by many as a challenge to the divine order itself. But there had been whispers of doubt. Decades before Galileo's birth, A Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus had proposed something radical. Perhaps the Earth was not the center of everything. Perhaps the Earth and other planets orbited the Sun. Copernicus had been cautious, publishing his ideas only at the very end of his life, and his work remained controversial, studied by some but rejected by many. Galileo had read Copernicus, and the idea intrigued him. But Galileo was not content with mere speculation. He wanted evidence, observation, proof that could convince even the skeptical. When Galileo heard that a Dutch spectacle maker had created a device that made distant objects appear closer, he immediately grasped its potential. He set about building his own version, improving the design until he had created a telescope far more powerful than any that had come before. And then, in those remarkable nights of 1609 and 1610, he turned it toward the sky. What he saw was astonishing. The moon, which had been thought to be a perfect sphere, revealed itself to be covered with mountains and craters, much like the Earth. It was not perfect and unchanging. It was a world with geography and features. The Milky Way, that hazy band of light across the night sky, dissolved into countless individual stars, far more than anyone had imagined existed. But the most significant discoveries were yet to come. Galileo observed Jupiter and noticed 4 small points of light near it. Night after night, he watched as these points moved, sometimes on one side of Jupiter, sometimes on the other. He realized with growing excitement that these were moons, orbiting Jupiter just as Copernicus had suggested the planets orbit the Sun. Here was proof that not everything in the heavens revolved around the Earth. He observed Venus, and saw that it went through phases like the Moon, growing larger and smaller, appearing full and crescent, and everything in between. This made perfect sense if Venus orbited the Sun, moving closer to and farther from Earth. But it made no sense in the old Earth-centered model. Galileo published his findings in a small book called Sidereus Nuncius, or Starry Messenger, in 1610. The book caused a sensation. Here were observations that anyone with a telescope could verify for themselves. The evidence was mounting that the old view of the cosmos was wrong, that Copernicus had been right, that the Earth moved through space like the other planets, orbiting the Sun. But evidence alone does not always convince, especially when beliefs are deeply held and reinforced by powerful institutions. Many philosophers and church officials resisted Galileo's findings. Some refused even to look through the telescope, dismissing what it showed as illusions or tricks of the device. Others argued that even if the observations were real, they must be interpreted differently, in ways that preserved the Earth's central position. Galileo continued his work, his observations, his experiments. He studied motion, rolling balls down inclined planes, timing their descent, discovering mathematical relationships that described how objects accelerate. He argued for the Copernican view with passion, and sometimes with sarcasm, writing dialogues that made the defenders of the old view seem foolish. In 1616, the Catholic Church officially declared that the idea of a moving Earth was contrary to Scripture. Galileo was warned not to defend or teach Copernican theory. For a time, he remained quiet, working on other problems. But in 1632, he published his dialogue concerning the 2 chief world systems, a book that presented arguments for both the Earth-centered and Sun-centered views, but made it clear which one the evidence supported. The church authorities were not pleased. Galileo was summoned to Rome, subjected to a trial by the Inquisition. He was elderly by then, in his late 60s, his health failing. Under threat of torture and imprisonment, he recanted, formally stating that he no longer held or defended the idea that the Earth moves. But legend tells us that as he rose from his knees after the recantation, he muttered under his breath, Separus I move. And yet it moves. Whether he actually said these words or not, they capture something essential about Galileo. His conviction that truth is discovered through observation and reason, not decreed by authority. Galileo spent his final years under house arrest, forbidden to publish or teach. But he continued to work, writing about motion and mechanics, receiving visits from younger scholars who would carry his ideas forward. He went blind in his last years, unable to see the stars he had revealed, but his mind remained sharp, his spirit unbroken. When Galileo died in 1642, the revolution he had helped begin was far from complete. But he had shown the way forward. Observe carefully, measure precisely, follow the evidence wherever it leads, even when it contradicts ancient authority and common belief. He had taught humanity to trust what could be seen and tested, to ask questions of nature and listen to the answers. As we rest, we can imagine those quiet nights when Galileo stood beneath the stars. I pressed to his telescope, seeing what no one had seen before. We can feel the wonder of that moment when the universe revealed itself to be so much larger, so much stranger, so much more beautiful than anyone had imagined. And we can be grateful for his courage, for his willingness to see truly and to speak that truth, even at great personal cost. Newton lived until 1727, celebrated and honored in his later years, though still often difficult in his personal relationships. He served as Master of the Royal Mint, reforming England's currency. He was elected President of the Royal Society. He was knighted by Queen Anne, becoming Sir Isaac Newton. But perhaps none of these honours mattered as much as the knowledge that he had, in his own words, seen farther by standing on the shoulders of giants, by building on the work of Galileo, Kepler, and all those who had come before, to create a new understanding of the universe. When asked once how he made his discoveries, Newton replied that he kept the problem constantly before his mind, turning it over and over, until the light gradually dawned. It was patience, concentration, and an unwillingness to accept easy answers that characterized his genius. As we rest now, we can imagine Newton in that garden, watching the apple fall, making the connection that would change everything. We can feel the profound peace that comes from understanding, from seeing that beneath the complexity of the world lies elegant simplicity, mathematical order, universal law. The heavens had been rewritten. The earth and sky were united. And humanity had learned that the universe, vast as it is, speaks a language we can comprehend. The language of mathematics, of careful observation, of reason guided by evidence. The cosmos was no longer an unknowable mystery. It was home, and we were beginning to understand how it worked. Power, energy, and invisible forces. Alessandro Volta, the gift of steady current. In a laboratory in northern Italy, near the shores of Lake Como, a gentleman scientist was assembling something that had never existed before. Alessandro Volta, already well respected for his work on gases and electricity, was stacking discs of silver and zinc, separated by cloth soaked in brine, building them into a tower. When he touched wires to the top and bottom of this pile, something remarkable happened. A steady, continuous flow of electric current. Not just a brief spark, but something that could last and last. The year was 1800, and Volta had just created the first true battery, the first source of continuous electrical power. Alessandro Volta was born in 1745 in Como, Italy, into a world lit by candles and warmed by wood fires, where the fastest communication was still carried by horses, and where electricity was known only as a curious phenomenon, a strange spark that could be coaxed from rubbed amber or generated by elaborate friction machines. It was a parlor trick, a scientific curiosity, but not yet something that seemed useful or controllable. Young Alessandro was educated by Jesuits, and though he was drawn to poetry and literature in his youth, by his teenage years he had become fascinated with natural philosophy, particularly with electricity. There was something mysterious and compelling about this invisible force that could make hair stand on end, that could pass through some materials, but not others, that could leap through the air in crackling sparks. Volta began conducting his own experiments, building electrical devices, corresponding with other scientists across Europe. In the 18th century, science was often a pursuit of gentlemen and aristocrats, people with the leisure and resources to experiment and observe. Volta fit this world well. He was charming, articulate, and diplomatic, able to move in both scientific and social circles with ease. In his early career, Volta made several important discoveries. He studied gases and found ways to collect them over mercury rather than water, allowing for the study of gases that dissolved in water. He invented an electrophorus, a device that could generate static electricity more reliably than previous methods. His work earned him recognition, and eventually a professorship at the University of Pavia. But Volta's greatest contribution came from his investigation into a controversy that had captured the attention of scientists across Europe. Luigi Galvani, another Italian scientist, had discovered that the legs of dead frogs would twitch when touched with two different metals. Galvani believed he had discovered a new kind of electricity, which he called animal electricity, a vital force inherent in living tissue. Volta was skeptical. He conducted his own careful experiments and came to a different conclusion. The electricity, he believed, came not from the animal tissue but from the contact between the two different metals, with the moist tissue of the frog merely conducting the current. To prove his theory, he needed to create an electrical current without any animal tissue at all. Through systematic experimentation, trying different combinations of metals and solutions, Volta developed his pile, which came to be called the voltaic pile or Volta's battery. It consisted of many pairs of discs, alternating zinc and silver or zinc and copper, with each pair separated by cardboard or cloth soaked in salt water or acid. When stacked together and connected by wires, this simple arrangement produced a continuous electric current. The significance of this invention cannot be overstated. Before Volta's pile, electrical phenomena were fleeting. A spark that jumped and was gone, a charge that built up and then dissipated. Now, for the first time, scientists had access to steady, reliable electricity. They could conduct experiments that lasted minutes, hours, even days. They could study electrical effects in detail, measuring and recording and understanding in ways that had never been possible before. Volta announced his discovery in 1800 through a letter to the Royal Society in London. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Scientists across Europe began building their own voltaic piles, experimenting with this new source of power. Within weeks, English scientists William Nicholson and Anthony Carlisle used a voltaic pile to decompose water into hydrogen and oxygen, the first chemical decomposition by electricity. The field of electrochemistry was born. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had conquered much of Europe and who fancied himself a patron of science, invited Volta to Paris to demonstrate his invention. Volta travelled to France in 1801 and presented his battery before Napoleon and the French scientific establishment. Napoleon was impressed and showered Volta with honours, including a gold medal and the title of Count. Volta returned to Italy celebrated and secure, continuing to work and teach until his retirement. He married late in life and had 3 sons, living comfortably on his estate near Como. He witnessed the beginning of the electrical age that his invention had made possible, though he could not have imagined how far it would go. The battery would become one of the foundations of modern life. Every electrical device that needed portable power, every telegraph system, every early electrical experiment depended on batteries. And while the design would evolve, becoming more efficient and powerful, the basic principle that Volta discovered, using chemical reactions to generate electrical current, remained the same. Volta lived until 1827, long enough to see his invention transform scientific research and to be honored by scientists and leaders across Europe. His name would live on in the volt, the unit of electrical potential, a fitting tribute to the man who gave the world its first reliable source of continuous electricity. As we rest now, we can imagine Volta in his laboratory, carefully assembling his pile, disc by disc, watching as the stack grows taller. We can picture the moment when he first touched the wires and felt the steady tingle of current flowing through them, when he realized that he had tamed electricity, making it continuous and controllable. And we can feel grateful for this elegant Italian gentleman who built a tower of metal discs and, in doing so, opened the door to the electrical age. Michael Faraday, the blacksmith's son who saw invisible fields. In the basement laboratory of the Royal Institution in London, a man with no formal education beyond elementary reading and writing was conducting experiments that would reshape humanity's understanding of the invisible forces that fill all space. Michael Faraday, the son of a blacksmith who had started his working life as a bookbinder's apprentice, was discovering the deep connections between electricity and magnetism, seeing patterns and relationships that others had missed, and preparing the way for the technological revolution that would transform the world. Faraday was born in 1791 in a small village south of London, into a family that was often poor and sometimes hungry. His father worked when he could, but illness often prevented him from earning enough to support the family. Michael's education was limited to the basics: reading, writing, and simple arithmetic. At 14, he was apprenticed to a bookbinder, learning a trade that would allow him to make a modest living. But something remarkable happened during those years of binding books. Faraday read them. Working in a bookshop gave him access to knowledge that would normally have been far beyond his reach. He read about science, about chemistry and electricity, and he was captivated. Here were people asking questions about how the world worked, conducting experiments, discovering principles. Faraday began to attend public lectures on science, taking detailed notes, teaching himself through observation and study. One day, a customer gave Faraday tickets to attend a series of lectures by Humphry Davy, one of the most famous scientists in England. Faraday went and was mesmerized. He took copious notes, bound them beautifully, and sent them to Davy along with a letter asking if there might be any way he could work in science. Davy was impressed by the young man's enthusiasm and attention to detail. When a position opened up at the Royal Institution, Davy hired Faraday as his laboratory assistant. It was 1813, and Faraday was 21 years old. He had found his calling. Working alongside Davy, traveling with him through Europe after the Napoleonic Wars ended, meeting the great scientists of the age, Faraday absorbed everything he could. He proved to be not just a skilled assistant, but a brilliant experimenter in his own right, with an intuitive grasp of how nature worked and an extraordinary ability to design experiments that revealed its secrets. Faraday's greatest work concerned electricity and magnetism. In 1820, a Danish scientist named Hans Christian Ørsted had discovered that an electric current flowing through a wire could deflect a compass needle. This was astonishing. Electricity and magnetism, previously thought to be separate phenomena, were somehow connected. Faraday was fascinated and began his own investigations. Within months, Faraday had demonstrated electromagnetic rotation. He could make a wire carrying electric current rotate continuously around a magnet, and a magnet rotate around a wire carrying current. It was the first electric motor, crude but functional, proof that electrical and magnetic forces could be harnessed to create motion. But Faraday wanted to understand more deeply. If electricity could produce magnetism, could magnetism produce electricity? For years, he experimented, trying different arrangements, different methods. And then, in 1831, he found it. When he moved a magnet near a coil of wire, or when he changed the current in one coil near another coil, electricity flowed in the wire. The motion or change was crucial. A static magnetic field did nothing, but a changing magnetic field induced an electric current. This was electromagnetic induction, and it was one of the most important discoveries in the history of science. Faraday demonstrated that you could generate electricity from motion and magnetism. This principle would become the basis for all electrical generators and transformers. Every power plant in the world, whether powered by coal, nuclear energy, wind, or falling water, uses electromagnetic induction to generate the electricity that powers modern civilization. But Faraday didn't stop with practical discoveries. He wanted to understand the nature of these forces. How did electricity and magnetism reach across space? What was the medium through which they acted? Faraday developed a concept that was revolutionary at the time: the field. He imagined space filled with invisible lines of force, curving and spreading around magnets and electric charges. These field lines weren't just mathematical abstractions. To Faraday, they were real, the actual mechanism by which forces were transmitted. This idea was hard for many scientists to accept. Most believed that forces acted at a distance, instantaneously jumping across empty space. But Faraday trusted what his experiments told him. He could trace out the patterns of iron filings around a magnet, seeing them arrange themselves along clear lines. He could measure how effects propagated, taking time to spread. The field, he insisted, was real. Faraday's approach to science was unique. Without advanced mathematics, he thought in terms of concrete images, physical models, intuitive understanding. He visualized the fields, imagined how they might behave, and then designed elegant experiments to test his ideas. His laboratory notebooks, filled with detailed observations and careful reasoning, show a mind of remarkable clarity and creativity. Throughout his life, Faraday remained humble and unpretentious. He refused most honors and turned down offers of wealth, preferring to continue his research. He was a devout member of a small Christian denomination, the Sandemanians, and his faith shaped his life, emphasizing simplicity, community, and the value of all work, whether intellectual or manual. Faraday also believed deeply in education and the public understanding of science. He established the tradition of the Royal Institution's Christmas lectures, presenting scientific ideas to young audiences in ways that were engaging and accessible. His lectures were famous for their clarity and their spectacular demonstrations. As he grew older, Faraday's memory began to fail, and he had to give up experimental work. But his contributions were secure. He had discovered electromagnetic induction, had demonstrated the principle of the electric motor, had introduced the concept of the field, and had laid the groundwork for countless technologies. The unit of capacitance, the farad, would be named in his honor. Faraday died quietly in 1867, sitting in his chair at home. He had lived to see his discoveries begin to transform the world, though the full electrical revolution was still to come. From a poor bookbinder's apprentice to one of the greatest experimental scientists who ever lived, Faraday's journey showed that genius can emerge from anywhere, that curiosity and careful observation can reveal the deepest secrets of nature. As we rest now, we can imagine Faraday in his laboratory, surrounded by coils of wire and magnets, watching a needle deflect as he moved a magnet, feeling the thrill of discovery as electricity flowed where none had been before. We can picture him sketching his field lines, trying to capture on paper the invisible patterns he sensed filling all of space. And we can be grateful for this gentle, humble man who saw so deeply into nature's workings, who gave us not just practical inventions, but a new way of understanding the forces that shape our world. James Clerk Maxwell, the mathematical poet. In a study in Scotland, surrounded by books and papers, a young man was working to translate experimental observations into the language of mathematics. James Clerk Maxwell, a physicist and mathematician of extraordinary ability, was taking the intuitive insights of Michael Faraday about electrical and magnetic fields and expressing them in precise equations. What emerged from this work would be more than just a mathematical description. It would be a unification of electricity, magnetism, and light itself, and it would reveal something profound about the nature of reality. Maxwell was born in 1831 in Edinburgh, Scotland, into a family that valued learning and curiosity. His father was a lawyer with an interest in technology and innovation, and young James grew up in an atmosphere of intellectual freedom and encouragement. He was a curious child, always asking questions, wanting to know how things worked and why. His favorite question, asked repeatedly of anyone who would listen, was simply, "What's the go of it? What makes it work? What is the principle?" Maxwell's formal education began at the Edinburgh Academy, where he initially struggled socially. He had a rural Scottish accent and wore unusual homemade clothes, and the other boys teased him, calling him dafty. But Maxwell's intellectual gifts soon became apparent. At just 14, he wrote a paper on methods for drawing mathematical curves that was presented to the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It was a remarkable achievement for one so young. Maxwell went on to study at the University of Edinburgh and then at Cambridge, where he distinguished himself in mathematics. But he was never just a pure mathematician. Maxwell was fascinated by the physical world, by how mathematical ideas could illuminate natural phenomena. He worked on diverse topics: the rings of Saturn, the theory of color vision, the behavior of gases. But it was electricity and magnetism that would become his greatest work. Maxwell had read Faraday's experimental papers and was deeply impressed by the older scientist's insights about fields. Faraday had described how electric and magnetic influences spread through space, how they could be visualized as lines of force filling all regions. But Faraday's descriptions were qualitative, based on intuition and experiment rather than mathematics. Maxwell set himself the task of giving mathematical form to Faraday's ideas. It was a monumental undertaking, requiring him to develop new mathematical techniques and to think deeply about the physical nature of fields. Between 1861 and 1865, Maxwell published a series of papers that built up his theory step by step. The heart of Maxwell's theory was a set of equations, just 4 fundamental relationships that described how electric and magnetic fields behave and how they interact with charges and currents. These equations, now known simply as Maxwell's equations, unified all the electrical and magnetic phenomena that had been discovered into one coherent framework. But Maxwell's equations did more than just organize existing knowledge. They predicted something new, something that no one had anticipated. When Maxwell analyzed his equations, he found that they allowed for waves, disturbances in the electric and magnetic fields that could propagate through empty space. And when he calculated the speed at which these electromagnetic waves would travel, he got a number that was startlingly familiar. It was the speed of light. The realization struck Maxwell with tremendous force. Light, this fundamental phenomenon that had been studied for centuries, was an electromagnetic wave. The same fields that Faraday had mapped with iron filings and compass needles were rippling through space all around us, and when they rippled at certain frequencies, they became visible to our eyes as light. This was an astonishing unification. Electricity, magnetism, and light, three phenomena that had seemed quite different, were all aspects of the same thing, the electromagnetic field. And the implications went further. If light was an electromagnetic wave, then there should be electromagnetic waves at other frequencies too, some with longer wavelengths than light, some with shorter. The electromagnetic spectrum, stretching from radio waves to gamma rays, was revealed as a unified whole. Maxwell's equations also explained why light travels at the constant speed it does, why it behaves as both a wave and can interact with matter, how it carries energy through space. They were elegant, powerful, and deeply beautiful. The physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, writing about Maxwell's equations, quoted Goethe. Was it a god who wrote these lines? But Maxwell's work went beyond electromagnetic theory. He made fundamental contributions to the kinetic theory of gases, showing how the properties of gases could be understood in terms of the motion of countless molecules. He introduced statistical methods into physics, recognizing that when dealing with huge numbers of particles, statistical laws become more important than the precise motion of each individual particle. Maxwell also had a playful, creative side. He wrote poetry, some serious and some whimsical. He enjoyed making mechanical models to help visualize abstract concepts. He was devoted to his wife, Catherine, and they worked together on some of his experiments. He was known for his kindness, his sense of humor, and his deep religious faith, which he saw as compatible with his scientific work. Tragically, Maxwell's life was cut short. He developed cancer and died in 1879 at the age of just 48, the same age at which his mother had died of the same disease. The scientific community mourned the loss of one of its brightest minds, a man who had barely begun to explore all the implications of his discoveries. In the years after Maxwell's death, his equations would be confirmed again and again. Heinrich Hertz would generate and detect radio waves, proving that electromagnetic waves really did exist beyond the visible spectrum. Guglielmo Marconi would use those waves to send messages across vast distances. Eventually, radio, television, radar, wireless communication of all kinds would flow from Maxwell's theoretical insight. Einstein would later say that Maxwell's work was the most profound change in the foundation of physics since Newton, that it prepared the way for relativity by showing that electromagnetic phenomena were not simply about forces between objects, but about fields that filled all space and time. As we rest now, we can imagine Maxwell at his desk, pen in hand, working through page after page of mathematical derivations, looking for the patterns that connect Faraday's field lines to the propagating waves of light. We can picture the moment when he first calculated the speed of electromagnetic waves and realized it matched the speed of light. The shock of recognition that these seemingly different phenomena were one and the same. And we can appreciate the profound beauty of a universe where light itself is revealed to be a ripple in invisible fields, where mathematics can unveil truths deeper than any our eyes alone could see. Nikola Tesla, the visionary of alternating current. In a laboratory crackling with electrical discharges, where artificial lightning arced between metal spheres and coils hummed with power, a thin man with intense eyes stood controlling forces that seemed almost magical. Nikola Tesla, inventor and visionary, was demonstrating the practical application of electromagnetic theory, showing how alternating current could be generated, transmitted over vast distances, and converted back into useful power. The electrical age was no longer just a scientific curiosity. It was becoming the foundation of modern civilization. Tesla was born in 1856 in Smiljan, a village in what is now Croatia, then part of the Austrian Empire. He was born, legend says, during a fierce lightning storm at midnight, and the midwife declared it was a bad omen, that the child would be a child of darkness. Tesla's mother supposedly replied, "No, he will be a child of light." It was an apt prediction. Tesla's father was an Orthodox priest who wanted his son to follow the same path. But young Nikola was drawn to invention and engineering from an early age. He had an extraordinary mind, capable of visualizing inventions in complete detail before building them, able to perform complex calculations mentally, possessing what he called a photographic memory. He claimed he could construct and test entire machines in his imagination, running them, modifying them, perfecting them, all without touching any physical materials. Tesla studied engineering at the Austrian Polytechnic in Graz and later at the University of Prague. It was during these student years that he first conceived of the rotating magnetic field and the alternating current motor. While his professor demonstrated a direct current motor and explained its limitations, Tesla suddenly envisioned a completely different approach, using alternating current that reversed direction many times per second and arranging the windings so that the magnetic field would rotate, pulling the rotor around with it. The vision was so clear, so complete, that Tesla was certain it would work. For years, Tesla carried this idea with him as he worked various engineering jobs across Europe. Then, in 1884, he made the fateful decision to emigrate to America, arriving in New York with little money, but carrying letters of introduction to Thomas Edison, already famous as the inventor of the light bulb and the architect of the direct current electrical system. Edison hired Tesla, and for a time they worked together, though their approaches could not have been more different. Edison was a tireless experimenter, trying countless variations until he found what worked. Tesla was a theorist and visionary, who planned carefully before building. Edison championed direct current, electricity that flowed steadily in one direction. Tesla believed the future belonged to alternating current. The two men parted ways, some say acrimoniously, though the details are disputed. Tesla struck out on his own, eventually attracting the attention of George Westinghouse, an industrialist who recognized the potential of alternating current. Westinghouse bought the rights to Tesla's AC motor and transformer patents, and together they began to build an electrical system to rival Edison's. What followed became known as the War of Currents. Edison's direct current system had been established first and had supporters and infrastructure. But it had severe limitations. DC power couldn't be transmitted more than a few miles without significant loss, requiring power stations every few blocks in a city. Alternating current, on the other hand, could be transformed to high voltages for efficient long-distance transmission, then stepped down to safe voltages for use in homes and factories. Tesla and Westinghouse demonstrated their system at the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, illuminating the fairgrounds with thousands of lights powered by AC generators. The display was spectacular, and it convinced many that alternating current was the future. The final triumph came when Tesla and Westinghouse won the contract to build the generators at Niagara Falls, creating the first large-scale hydroelectric power plant using AC current. From Niagara Falls, electricity was transmitted to Buffalo, 20 miles away, and then eventually to New York City. It was clear that AC had won. But Tesla's ambitions went far beyond simply winning a technological competition. He envisioned a world transformed by electricity, where power was abundant and wireless communication spanned the globe. In his laboratory in Colorado Springs, he built enormous coils that generated millions of volts, creating electrical discharges over 100 feet long. He claimed to have transmitted electrical power wirelessly over distance, and he dreamed of a system that could provide free electricity to the entire world, drawn from the Earth's natural electrical phenomena. His most ambitious project was Wardenclyffe Tower, a massive structure on Long Island intended to demonstrate wireless power transmission and worldwide radio communication. Tesla poured his resources into this project, but it was never completed. Funding dried up, partly because investors couldn't see how to make money from free wireless power, and partly because other inventors, like Marconi, were developing more practical radio systems. Tesla's later years were marked by financial difficulty and increasing eccentricity. He lived in hotels, often unable to pay his bills, surviving on the generosity of friends and admirers. He developed obsessive behaviors and phobias. He made grandiose claims about inventions that may or may not have existed. He became a figure of both admiration and pity, a genius whose visions had exceeded the practical possibilities of his time. And yet, Tesla's contributions were immense and lasting. Every electrical device we use today runs on alternating current derived from his patents. The transformers that step voltage up and down, the motors that power countless machines, the generators that produce electricity in power plants, all trace back to Tesla's innovations. The unit of magnetic flux density, the Tesla, is named in his honor. Tesla also pioneered radio technology, though Marconi often received credit. He experimented with X-rays, studied high-frequency currents, and demonstrated principles that would later be used in radar and radio astronomy. He held hundreds of patents and inspired generations of inventors and engineers. Tesla died in 1943, alone in a New York hotel room, accompanied only by the pigeons he had befriended and fed throughout his later years. His papers and possessions were seized by the US government, concerned about what secrets they might contain in the midst of World War II. Many were later returned to his family, and are now in a museum in Belgrade. What are we to make of Tesla? A brilliant inventor who gave us the electrical infrastructure of modern civilization. A visionary who saw possibilities others dismissed. A showman who demonstrated electrical phenomena with theatrical flair. A tragic figure whose ambitions exceeded what was practically achievable in his lifetime. Perhaps he was all of these things. As we rest now, we can imagine Tesla in his laboratory, surrounded by humming coils and crackling discharges, manipulating invisible electromagnetic forces with skill and confidence. We can picture the lights of the Columbian Exposition blazing to life, powered by his alternating current system, showing the world that electricity could be tamed and made useful on a grand scale. And we can appreciate how theoretical insights, Maxwell's equations describing electromagnetic fields, became practical reality through the inventions of creative minds like Tesla's, bringing power and light to homes and cities around the world. The invisible forces had been revealed, understood, and harnessed. Electricity flowed through wires and powered machines. The modern world was being born, built on the foundation of mathematical laws and practical inventions, of theoretical understanding and engineering skill. The age of power had begun. Life, evolution, and inheritance. Charles Darwin, the gentle revolutionary. On a small ship sailing through distant waters, a young naturalist stood at the rail, watching the coastline of an unfamiliar land slide by. Charles Darwin, just 22 years old, had set out on what was meant to be a 2-year voyage aboard HMS Beagle. It would stretch to 5 years, and it would change not just Darwin's life, but humanity's understanding of itself and all living things. What he observed on that journey would lead him to a profound insight. Life was not fixed and unchanging, but had evolved over immense spans of time through a process of natural selection. Darwin was born in 1809 in Shrewsbury, England, into a wealthy and intellectual family. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, had been a physician and poet who had speculated about evolution in his own writings. His father was a successful doctor who hoped Charles would follow in his footsteps. Young Charles was sent to study medicine in Edinburgh, but he found surgery distressing and lectures boring. His real passion was for nature, for collecting beetles and exploring the countryside. When medicine didn't work out, Darwin was sent to Cambridge to study theology, with the idea that he might become a country parson. This seemed a reasonable compromise. He could have a quiet living and pursue his interest in natural history as a hobby. But fate had other plans. Through connections at Cambridge, Darwin was offered a position as a naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle, which was preparing for a surveying expedition around the coast of South America. Darwin's father initially objected, but was persuaded to let Charles go. In December 1831, the Beagle set sail, and Darwin embarked on the great adventure of his life. He suffered terribly from seasickness, but when the ship was at anchor or when he could go ashore, he was in his element, observing, collecting, taking meticulous notes on everything he encountered. Darwin saw remarkable things on that voyage. In South America, he found fossils of extinct giant mammals that resembled, but were much larger than, the living animals of the region. On the Galapagos Islands, he observed finches that differed from island to island, their beaks shaped differently depending on the available food sources. He saw mockingbirds that varied by island, and giant tortoises whose shells differed in shape depending on which island they inhabited. At the time, Darwin didn't fully grasp the significance of these observations, but later, as he reviewed his notes and specimens back in England, patterns began to emerge. The extinct giant mammals resembled living ones because they were related, ancestors perhaps, from a time when different conditions favored larger size. The island birds varied because they had adapted to different environments, their populations diverging over time. But how did this happen? How did species change? Darwin knew about selective breeding, how farmers and pigeon fanciers could shape the characteristics of their animals by choosing which ones to breed. Over many generations, dramatic changes could be achieved. But what could act as the selector in nature? The answer came to Darwin in 1838, after reading an essay by Thomas Malthus on population growth. Malthus had pointed out that populations tend to grow faster than their food supply, leading to competition for resources. Darwin realized that this competition was the key. In any population, there would be variation, individuals slightly different from one another. Those individuals whose variations made them better suited to their environment would be more likely to survive and reproduce. Those less suited would be more likely to die before reproducing. Over many generations, this process, natural selection, would gradually shape populations, adapting them to their environments. It was a simple idea, elegant and powerful, and it explained so much. It explained why species seemed so well suited to their environments. It explained the similarities between related species. It explained the existence of vestigial organs, remnants of features that had been useful to ancestors but were no longer needed. It explained the patterns in the fossil record, with older forms giving way to newer ones. But Darwin also knew his idea was revolutionary and would be controversial. It suggested that species were not fixed creations, but had changed over time, that all life was related through common ancestry, that humans themselves had evolved from earlier forms. This challenged not just scientific orthodoxy, but religious belief about the special creation of each species and the unique status of humanity. So Darwin proceeded carefully. For more than 20 years, he gathered evidence, conducted experiments, corresponded with other naturalists, and quietly built his case. He might have delayed even longer, but in 1858, he received a letter from a younger naturalist named Alfred Russel Wallace, who had independently conceived of the same idea of evolution by natural selection. Faced with the prospect of being preempted, Darwin arranged for both his work and Wallace's to be presented jointly to the Linnean Society. The following year, in 1859, Darwin published his masterwork, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. He had written it as clearly and persuasively as he could, marshalling evidence from geology, paleontology, biogeography, embryology, and domestication. He anticipated objections and addressed them. He explained how complex structures like the eye could evolve through gradual steps, each providing some advantage. The book caused an immediate sensation. It sold out on the first day. Some scientists embraced it enthusiastically, seeing how it unified and explained countless observations. Others rejected it, unable to accept such a radical departure from traditional ideas. The public debate was fierce, with some religious leaders denouncing the theory as atheistic and degrading to human dignity. Darwin himself remained largely above the fray. He was not a public debater by nature. He was shy and often ill, suffering from mysterious ailments that historians still debate. He let others, like his friend Thomas Huxley, defend his theory in public while he continued his research at his home in Down, Kent, conducting experiments, writing more books, always gathering more evidence. Over the years, Darwin published works on orchid pollination, on carnivorous plants, on the expression of emotions in humans and animals, on the role of earthworms in soil formation. Everything he studied seemed to illuminate some aspect of evolution. He showed that seemingly trivial features often had important functions, that complex behaviors and structures had evolved through natural selection, that all life was interconnected in a vast web of descent with modification. Darwin's theory transformed biology from a science of description and classification into a science of explanation and understanding. Every question about life could now be approached by asking, how did this evolve? What advantage did it provide? What is its history? Evolution became the unifying principle of biology, the framework that made sense of all the diversity and complexity of life. Darwin lived until 1882, long enough to see his theory gain widespread acceptance among scientists. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, near Isaac Newton, an honor that recognized his profound contribution to human knowledge. The gentle, patient observer, who had set sail on the Beagle as a young man, had become one of the most influential scientists in history. As we rest now, we can imagine Darwin on a Galapagos beach, watching finches hop among the rocks, noting the shapes of their beaks, pondering the significance of the variations he observed. We can picture him in his study at Down House, surrounded by plants and specimens, writing steadily day after day, building his careful argument. And we can appreciate the courage it took to propose an idea that so fundamentally changed our understanding of life, and the patience to support it with such overwhelming evidence that it became undeniable. Gregor Mendel, The Monk in the Garden. In the peaceful gardens of an Augustinian monastery in Brno, a monk tended his plants with extraordinary care, making precise notes about the colors of their flowers, the shapes of their seeds, the heights of their stems. Gregor Mendel was conducting experiments that seemed simple, almost humble, but they would reveal the fundamental laws of inheritance, the rules by which traits pass from parents to offspring. Though his work would be ignored in his lifetime, it would later become the foundation of genetics, the science that explains how life perpetuates itself. Mendel was born in 1822 in a small village in what is now the Czech Republic, then part of the Austrian Empire. His family were peasant farmers, and life was hard. Young Gregor was bright, talented in his studies, but his family struggled to afford his education. Eventually, after periods of near starvation as a student, Mendel decided to enter the monastery, which would provide him with security and the opportunity to continue learning. The Augustinian monastery at Brno was a remarkable place, a center of learning and scientific inquiry. The monks there believed that understanding the natural world was a way of understanding God's creation. Mendel flourished in this environment. He was sent to the University of Vienna to study mathematics and science, and though he failed the examination to become a certified teacher, he gained a thorough education in physics, mathematics, and biology. Returning to the monastery, Mendel taught at the local school and began conducting experiments in the monastery garden. He was interested in the question of heredity. How do parents pass characteristics to their offspring? Why do children sometimes resemble one parent more than the other? Why do traits sometimes skip generations? These were old questions, and there were many theories, but little systematic evidence. Most people believed in some form of blending inheritance, that the traits of the parents mixed together like paint. But this didn't explain many observations, like why a trait could disappear for a generation and then reappear, or why offspring sometimes had characteristics unlike either parent. Mendel decided to approach the problem with mathematical precision. He chose to work with pea plants, which were easy to grow, bred readily, and had clear, distinct traits that he could track: tall or short, green or yellow seeds, smooth or wrinkled seeds, and so on. Over the course of 8 years, from 1856 to 1863, Mendel grew and observed nearly 30,000 pea plants, carefully controlling pollination, counting the offspring, recording the results with meticulous care. What Mendel discovered was remarkable in its clarity. Traits didn't blend. They were inherited as discrete units, what we now call genes. Each plant had 2 copies of each hereditary factor, one from each parent. When the plant reproduced, it passed 1 copy to each offspring. Some factors were dominant, meaning they would show up in the offspring even if only 1 copy was present. Other factors were recessive, showing up only if the offspring inherited that factor from both parents. This explained everything Mendel observed. When he crossed tall plants with short plants, all the offspring were tall, because tall was dominant. But when he bred those offspring together, some of the next generation were short, because they inherited the recessive short factor from both parents. The ratio was precise, 3 tall to 1 short, exactly what his theory predicted. Mendel presented his findings to the local Natural History Society in 1865 and published them in the Society's journal in 1866. He expected that his work would cause excitement, that it would be recognized as an important contribution. Instead, it was largely ignored. The journal was obscure, and the few scientists who read it didn't grasp the significance of what Mendel had discovered. Some thought his mathematical approach was too abstract, too removed from the biological reality. Others were focused on different questions and didn't see how Mendel's work connected to their interests. Mendel sent copies of his paper to prominent scientists, but received little response. Disappointed but not bitter, he continued his other duties at the monastery. In 1868, he was elected abbot, which brought administrative responsibilities that left him little time for scientific research. He spent his later years managing the monastery's affairs, dealing with tax disputes with the government, and becoming increasingly isolated from the scientific work he had loved. Mendel died in 1884, believing that his scientific work had been a failure, that his discoveries would be forgotten. For 16 years, his papers on heredity gathered dust in obscure journals, unread and uncited. But in 1900, something remarkable happened. 3 scientists in 3 different countries, Hugo de Vries in the Netherlands, Karl Correns in Germany, and Erich von Tschermak in Austria, independently rediscovered Mendel's laws of inheritance while conducting their own experiments. When they searched the literature, they found that Mendel had anticipated all their findings 35 years earlier. Suddenly, Mendel's work was recognized for what it was, a fundamental breakthrough. The science of genetics grew rapidly from this foundation. Scientists realized that Mendel's hereditary factors corresponded to physical structures in cells, the chromosomes that could be seen under microscopes dividing and recombining during reproduction. The precise mathematical ratios Mendel had observed reflected the physical mechanics of how chromosomes were distributed to offspring. Later discoveries would reveal the molecular nature of genes, the DNA that carries genetic information, but the basic principles Mendel discovered remained true. Traits are inherited as discrete units. Offspring receive one copy from each parent. Some alleles are dominant, others recessive. The ratios Mendel calculated still hold. Mendel's work also proved crucial in reconciling Darwin's theory of evolution with the mechanism of inheritance. Darwin had struggled to explain how variations could be preserved. Blending inheritance would seem to dilute them away. But Mendel's particulate inheritance meant that variations could be maintained, hidden in recessive form if necessary, waiting to be expressed when conditions favored them. Evolution by natural selection now had a mechanism that made sense. As we rest now, we can imagine Mendel in his garden, carefully tying little bags over the flowers to control which plants pollinated which, counting seeds one by one, recording results in neat tables. We can picture him working out the mathematical ratios, seeing the patterns emerge from thousands of observations, realizing that he had found the fundamental laws that governed inheritance. And we can feel the quiet satisfaction of patient, careful work, of discovering truths that would outlast the temporary neglect of one's contemporaries, of planting seeds, both literal and metaphorical, that would bear fruit long after the gardener was gone. Louis Pasteur, The Invisible World Revealed. In a laboratory in Paris, surrounded by glass flasks and microscopes, a chemist-turned-biologist was peering into a world that most people didn't know existed. Louis Pasteur was studying microorganisms, tiny creatures invisible to the naked eye, and he was discovering that they played crucial roles in disease, in decay, in fermentation, in all of life. His work would not only advance scientific understanding, but would save countless lives, making him one of the most celebrated scientists of his time. Pasteur was born in 1822 in a small town in eastern France, the son of a tanner. His family was not wealthy, but they valued education and worked to give their children opportunities. Young Louis was a talented artist, and for a time it seemed he might pursue painting. But his real gifts lay in science, and he excelled in his studies, eventually earning a doctorate in physics and chemistry. Pasteur's early work was in chemistry, studying the structure of crystals and discovering that some molecules could exist in mirror image forms, like left and right hands. This was important work, but it was his investigation of fermentation that would lead him into biology and to his greatest discoveries. In the 1850s, Pasteur was asked to help the French wine industry solve problems with wine spoilage. Some batches of wine were turning sour, becoming vinegar instead of aging properly. Pasteur investigated and discovered that fermentation was not merely a chemical process, as most scientists believed, but was caused by living microorganisms, yeasts, that converted sugar into alcohol. When the wrong microorganisms got into the wine, different products resulted, including the acetic acid that made vinegar. This was a revolutionary idea. It meant that these tiny creatures, too small to see without a microscope, were not just passive inhabitants of the world, but were active agents, causing changes, producing substances, affecting everything they touched. Pasteur developed a process to prevent spoilage, heating the wine to a temperature high enough to kill the harmful microorganisms, but not so high as to damage the wine's flavor. This process, which came to be called pasteurization, could also be applied to milk, beer, and other beverages, making them safer and longer-lasting. It was a simple technique, but it would save countless lives by preventing the spread of disease through contaminated food and drink. But Pasteur's investigations went deeper. He tackled one of the great questions of his time. Could life arise spontaneously from non-living matter, or did all life come from pre-existing life? Many people believed in spontaneous generation, that maggots could arise from rotting meat, that microorganisms could simply appear in broth or other nutrient-rich liquids. Pasteur designed elegant experiments to test this. He showed that when broth was heated to sterilize it, and then kept in a sealed container, no microorganisms appeared. But if the container was opened, exposing the broth to air, microorganisms soon appeared and multiplied. He created specially shaped flasks with long, curved necks that allowed air to enter, but trapped dust and microorganisms. Broth in these flasks remained sterile indefinitely, proving that life did not arise spontaneously, but came from microscopic organisms already present in the air. This settled a long scientific debate and had profound implications. It meant that decay, fermentation, and many diseases were caused by living organisms that could be identified, studied, and potentially controlled. Pasteur then turned his attention to diseases themselves. Silkworms in France were dying from mysterious diseases, devastating the silk industry. Pasteur, who had never studied silkworms before, took on the problem. Through careful observation and experimentation, he identified the microorganisms causing the diseases and developed methods to prevent their spread. He saved the silk industry and demonstrated that diseases could be understood and controlled through scientific investigation. But it was Pasteur's work on vaccination that would become his greatest legacy. The concept of vaccination had been introduced by Edward Jenner decades earlier, who had used cowpox to protect against smallpox. But Jenner hadn't understood why it worked. Pasteur discovered the principle. If you could expose someone to a weakened or killed form of a disease-causing organism, their body would develop immunity, protecting them against the full-strength disease. Pasteur applied this principle to various diseases. He developed a vaccine for chicken cholera by using bacteria that had been weakened by exposure to air. He created a vaccine for anthrax, a devastating disease of livestock, by using heat-attenuated bacteria. Each success built on the previous one, refining the technique. Then came the dramatic test, rabies. Rabies was a terrifying disease, transmitted by the bites of infected animals, invariably fatal once symptoms appeared. Pasteur developed a vaccine by using dried spinal cord tissue from infected rabbits, which contained weakened rabies virus. He tested it on animals successfully, but using it on humans was another matter entirely. In 1885, a 9-year-old boy named Joseph Meister was brought to Pasteur. He had been severely bitten by a rabid dog and was sure to develop rabies and die. Pasteur agonized over the decision. The vaccine had never been tested on humans, and he was not a physician. But the boy would die without intervention. Pasteur administered the vaccine over several days, and the boy survived. He never developed rabies. The news spread rapidly, and soon people who had been bitten by rabid animals were coming to Paris from all over the world seeking Pasteur's treatment. He saved nearly all of them. The success was so great that funds were raised to establish the Pasteur Institute, which would continue research on infectious diseases and produce vaccines. Pasteur's work transformed medicine. He had shown that many diseases were caused by microorganisms, that these diseases could be prevented through hygiene and sterilization, and that immunity could be conferred through vaccination. The germ theory of disease, which Pasteur championed along with other scientists like Robert Koch, became the foundation of modern medicine. Pasteur suffered a stroke in 1868 that left him partially paralyzed, but he continued his research for many more years, driven by a deep commitment to using science to reduce human suffering. When he died in 1895, he was mourned as a national hero, and he was given a state funeral, an extraordinary honor for a scientist. As we rest now, we can imagine Pasteur peering through his microscope, watching the invisible world come into focus, seeing the tiny organisms moving, multiplying, carrying out their invisible work. We can picture the moment when the boy Joseph Meister, who should have died, instead recovered, proving that human ingenuity could defeat even the most terrifying diseases. And we can feel grateful for the patient investigation that revealed the invisible world of microorganisms, transforming our understanding of life and giving us the tools to protect ourselves from disease. Alexander Fleming, the fortunate observer. In a cluttered laboratory in London, a Scottish bacteriologist returned from vacation to find his cultured dishes contaminated. Most scientists would have been annoyed, would have simply discarded the ruined experiments and started over. But Alexander Fleming was observant, and he noticed something strange. Around one of the contaminating molds, the bacteria had died. Where the mold grew, the bacteria could not. It was 1928, and Fleming had stumbled upon penicillin, the first true antibiotic, a discovery that would save more lives than perhaps any other medical advance in history. Fleming was born in 1881 on a farm in rural Scotland, the seventh of 8 children. He grew up exploring the countryside, developing a keen eye for observation and a practical, straightforward approach to problems. After his father died, his family moved to London, and Alexander attended school there, eventually studying medicine at St. Mary's Hospital Medical School. Fleming was a capable student, but not particularly exceptional. He qualified as a physician, but was drawn more to research than to clinical practice. He joined the inoculation department at St. Mary's, working under Omroth Wright, a pioneer in vaccine therapy. Fleming proved to be a skilled bacteriologist, patient in growing and studying the microorganisms that cause disease. During World War I, Fleming served in the Royal Army Medical Corps, treating wounded soldiers in field hospitals in France. He saw firsthand the terrible toll of infected wounds. Soldiers would survive their initial injuries only to die days later from bacterial infections that spread through their damaged tissue. The antiseptics used to treat wounds often did more harm than good, killing the patient's own cells and tissues without effectively killing the bacteria deep in the wounds. Fleming conducted studies showing that antiseptics often hindered healing rather than helping it. He argued for better wound cleaning and drainage rather than harsh chemical treatments. But he had no alternative to offer, no way to kill the bacteria without harming the tissue. This frustrated him deeply and motivated his later research. After the war, Fleming returned to St. Mary's and continued his bacteriological research. In 1921, he made his first significant discovery. He had a cold and, characteristically, decided to study his own nasal mucus under the microscope. He cultivated bacteria from his mucus and then, on impulse, added some of the clear mucus itself to the bacterial culture. To his surprise, the bacteria dissolved. He had discovered lysozyme, an enzyme present in tears, saliva, and mucus that could kill certain bacteria. It was the body's own natural defense mechanism. Lysozyme wasn't a practical medicine. It killed mostly harmless bacteria, not the dangerous ones, but it proved that antibacterial substances existed in nature. Fleming wrote about it, but the discovery didn't attract much attention. He continued his work, always looking, always curious. Then came September 1928. Fleming had been on vacation, and when he returned, he was cleaning up his laboratory, looking through old culture plates before disposing of them. One plate caught his eye. It had been growing colonies of Staphylococcus bacteria, but it had become contaminated with a mold. Around the mold, there was a clear zone where no bacteria grew. The mold had secreted something that killed the bacteria. A lesser scientist might have missed this, or dismissed it as an interesting curiosity. But Fleming recognized its potential significance. He carefully preserved the mold and began studying it. He identified it as a species of Penicillium, a common mold related to the one that grows on bread. He grew the mold in broth and found that the broth itself, even with the mold removed, had antibacterial properties. He named the active substance penicillin. Fleming conducted experiments showing that penicillin could kill many types of harmful bacteria, including those that caused pneumonia, meningitis, and wound infections. Even better, it seemed to have little effect on human cells. It was exactly what he had been looking for since the war, a substance that could kill bacteria without harming the patient. But Fleming faced a problem. He was a bacteriologist, not a chemist. Penicillin was difficult to produce in quantity, and even more difficult to purify and stabilize. The crude preparations he could make lost their potency quickly. Fleming published his findings in 1929, but without a practical way to produce penicillin as a medicine, it remained a laboratory curiosity. For more than a decade, penicillin was largely forgotten, mentioned occasionally in scientific literature, but not pursued. Fleming continued his other research, and his discovery might have remained an interesting footnote in medical history. But in 1938, at Oxford University, a team of scientists led by Howard Florey and Ernst Boris Chain began investigating antibacterial substances. They came across Fleming's paper on penicillin and decided to study it further. Florey was a physiologist, Chain was a biochemist, and together they had the skills Fleming lacked. They developed methods to produce penicillin in larger quantities and to purify it. They tested it on mice infected with deadly bacteria and found it was remarkably effective. In 1941, with World War II raging, they tried penicillin on a human patient, a policeman dying from a bacterial infection. The patient began to improve almost immediately, his fever dropping, his condition stabilizing. But the supply of penicillin ran out before he was fully cured, and he relapsed and died. It was a bittersweet result. Penicillin worked, but they needed more of it. The challenge of mass production was taken up by pharmaceutical companies, particularly in the United States, which had the industrial capacity to produce penicillin on a large scale. By 1944, enough penicillin was being produced to treat all the Allied soldiers who needed it. Infections that would have been fatal were now curable. Soldiers with wounds that would have killed them survived. The impact on the war and on medicine was enormous. After the war, penicillin became widely available for civilian use. Diseases that had been death sentences, bacterial pneumonia, infected wounds, scarlet fever, syphilis, became treatable. The death rate from infection plummeted. Penicillin ushered in the antibiotic age, and other antibiotics were soon discovered, each effective against different types of bacteria. In 1945, Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine for the discovery and development of penicillin. Fleming became famous, though he was uncomfortable with celebrity. He traveled the world giving lectures, always emphasizing that his discovery had been partly accidental, that he had simply been observant enough to notice what others might have overlooked. Fleming also warned about the danger of bacteria developing resistance to antibiotics if they were misused. He saw in laboratory experiments that bacteria could adapt, and he cautioned that penicillin should be used carefully, in adequate doses, and for appropriate durations. His warnings were prescient. Antibiotic resistance would become a major challenge in later decades. Fleming died in 1955, having lived to see his accidental discovery transform medicine and save millions of lives. He was buried in St. Paul's Cathedral, an honor reserved for Britain's most distinguished citizens. As we rest now, we can imagine Fleming in his laboratory, picking up that contaminated culture plate, noticing the clear zone around the mold, recognizing in that moment that something significant had happened. We can picture the first patients receiving penicillin, their fevers breaking, their infections clearing, their lives saved by a substance produced by a common mold. And we can appreciate how observation and curiosity, the willingness to notice what others overlook and to investigate what seems curious, can lead to discoveries that change the world. From Darwin's patient observations of finches to Mendel's careful counting of peas to Pasteur's investigations of the invisible to Fleming's fortunate contamination, biology had become a science that not only explained life, but could preserve it and enhance it. The living world was understood, and that understanding had become the foundation of healing. The atom shattered Ernest Rutherford, the nucleus revealed. In a basement laboratory at the University of Manchester, a team of researchers was conducting an experiment that seemed almost absurdly simple. They were firing tiny particles at a thin sheet of gold foil and watching where the particles went. Most passed straight through, as expected. But occasionally, astonishingly, a particle would bounce back, as if it had hit something solid. Ernest Rutherford, the brilliant experimentalist from New Zealand who led the team, was stunned. It was, he later said, as incredible as if you had fired a shell at tissue paper and it came back and hit you. The year was 1909, and Rutherford had just discovered that atoms had a nucleus, a tiny, dense core at their center. The atom was mostly empty space. Rutherford was born in 1871 in a rural area of New Zealand, the fourth of 12 children. His father was a farmer and wheelwright, and the family worked hard to make ends meet. Young Ernest was bright and won scholarships that allowed him to attend university, first in New Zealand and then at Cambridge University in England, where he worked in the Cavendish laboratory under J.J. Thomson, the discoverer of the electron. Rutherford's genius lay in experimental physics. He had an intuitive sense for how to design experiments that would reveal nature's secrets, and he had the skill and patience to carry them out. He was also blessed with tremendous energy and enthusiasm. His booming voice and hearty laugh were legendary, and he inspired fierce loyalty in his students and colleagues. In the late 1890s, scientists were investigating the mysterious phenomenon of radioactivity, discovered by Henri Becquerel and studied intensively by Marie and Pierre Curie. Certain elements seemed to spontaneously emit invisible rays that could penetrate matter and expose photographic plates. Rutherford began studying these rays and discovered that there were at least two types, which he called alpha and beta rays. Alpha rays were easily stopped by a sheet of paper. Beta rays could penetrate much farther. Rutherford moved to McGill University in Canada, where he continued his investigations. He showed that radioactivity involved the transformation of one element into another, that atoms of radium were spontaneously decaying into atoms of other elements, releasing energy in the process. This was revolutionary. For centuries, atoms had been thought of as fundamental, unchangeable building blocks. Now Rutherford was showing that atoms could transform, could break apart, could release the energy locked within them. In 1907, Rutherford returned to England, taking up a position at the University of Manchester. It was there, with his assistants Hans Geiger and Ernest Marsden, that he conducted the gold foil experiment. They used alpha particles, which Rutherford had identified as helium nuclei, fast-moving and relatively heavy. When fired at the thin gold foil, most went straight through with little deflection, suggesting that atoms were mostly empty space. But about 1 in 8,000 bounced back at large angles, some nearly straight back toward the source. Rutherford spent months pondering this result. What could cause such dramatic deflections? Gradually, the answer became clear. The atom must have a tiny, dense, positively charged nucleus at its center, containing most of the atom's mass. The electrons must orbit this nucleus at relatively large distances, like planets around a sun. When an alpha particle happened to approach very close to a nucleus, the electrical repulsion between the positive charges would deflect it sharply, even reversing its direction. This nuclear model of the atom was published in 1911 and represented a fundamental shift in understanding. The atom was not a uniform blob of matter, as some had thought, nor was it a plum pudding of electrons embedded in positive charge, as Thomson had suggested. It was mostly empty space, with a tiny nucleus containing nearly all the mass and positive charge, surrounded by orbiting electrons. Rutherford's model raised new questions. Why didn't the electrons, spiraling around the nucleus, radiate energy and spiral inward, causing the atom to collapse? This problem would be addressed by his student, Niels Bohr. But Rutherford had revealed the basic structure, had shown that atoms had architecture, that they were systems that could be studied and understood. Rutherford continued his research, discovering the proton, the positively charged particle in the nucleus. He predicted the existence of the neutron, another particle in the nucleus that had no charge, though the neutron wouldn't be discovered until after his death by his student James Chadwick. He explored artificial transmutation, bombarding elements with alpha particles to transform them into other elements, achieving the ancient alchemist's dream through nuclear physics. During World War I, Rutherford worked on submarine detection, though he always preferred pure research to applied work. After the war, he returned to Cambridge as director of the Cavendish Laboratory, where he led a remarkable team of physicists who made discovery after discovery about the atomic nucleus and the particles that composed it. Rutherford was known for his directness and his lack of pretension. He had little patience for overcomplicated theories or woolly thinking. All science is either physics or stamp collecting, he once joked, by which he meant that physics uncovered fundamental laws while other sciences merely catalogued phenomena. It was said with characteristic good humor, though it perhaps didn't endear him to chemists and biologists. He was generous with credit and supportive of his students, many of whom went on to become leading physicists in their own right. The Cavendish under Rutherford was a place of excitement and discovery, where young scientists felt they were uncovering the deepest secrets of matter. Rutherford died suddenly in 1937, following complications from a minor surgical procedure. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, near Newton and Darwin, joining the pantheon of Britain's greatest scientists. His legacy was immense. He had revealed the structure of the atom, had pioneered nuclear physics, had shown that atoms could be transformed and that they contained enormous energy. The atomic age, with all its promise and peril, rested on foundations that Rutherford had laid. As we rest now, we can imagine those alpha particles streaming toward the gold foil, most passing through unimpeded, but occasionally one striking something small and dense and bouncing back. We can picture Rutherford's amazement at this result, his months of contemplation, and then the sudden clarity of understanding. The atom has a nucleus, a tiny sun around which electrons orbit. The invisible had been made visible, the structure of matter revealed. And we can feel the satisfaction of seeing deeply into the heart of things, of understanding what matter truly is at its smallest scale. Niels Bohr, Quantum Leaps and Atomic Structure. In Copenhagen, a young Danish physicist was wrestling with a profound problem. Ernest Rutherford had shown that the atom had a nuclear structure, but this structure seemed to defy the laws of physics. According to classical electromagnetic theory, the orbiting electrons should radiate energy and spiral into the nucleus in a fraction of a second. Atoms should be unstable, and yet they persisted. Niels Bohr realized that something fundamental was missing from classical physics, that the atomic world operated according to different rules. In 1913, he proposed a bold solution. Electrons could only occupy certain specific orbits, and they could jump between these orbits only by absorbing or emitting discrete packets of energy. The quantum nature of reality was beginning to reveal itself. Bohr was born in 1885 in Copenhagen, into an academic family. His father was a professor of physiology, and the family home was a gathering place for intellectuals and scientists. Young Niels grew up in an atmosphere of learning and discussion, developing a thoughtful, philosophical approach to science that would characterize his entire career. Bohr excelled in physics and mathematics, completing his doctorate at the University of Copenhagen in 1911. He then travelled to England to work with J.J. Thomson at Cambridge, but found the experience disappointing. Thomson was not particularly interested in Bohr's ideas. So Bohr moved to Manchester to work with Rutherford, and there he found an environment where his creativity could flourish. Rutherford's nuclear model of the atom fascinated Bohr, but he immediately saw its theoretical problems. Classical physics said that accelerating charges radiate electromagnetic energy. An electron orbiting a nucleus is constantly accelerating, constantly changing direction. It should therefore constantly radiate energy, losing speed and spiraling inward. The entire atom should collapse in less than a billionth of a second. And yet atoms were stable, existing for indefinite periods. Moreover, atoms of each element emitted light at very specific wavelengths when heated or energized. Hydrogen, for instance, produced a characteristic pattern of spectral lines, specific colors, specific wavelengths, in a precise mathematical relationship discovered by Johann Balmer decades earlier. Why these specific wavelengths and no others? Bohr realized that the solution required abandoning some cherished assumptions of classical physics. He proposed that electrons could only exist in certain discrete orbits, each orbit corresponding to a specific energy level. In these special orbits, electrons did not radiate energy. They were stable. An electron could jump from one orbit to another, but only by absorbing or emitting a discrete packet of energy, a quantum of energy, corresponding to the energy difference between the orbits. When an electron jumped from a higher energy orbit to a lower one, it emitted a photon of light with energy exactly equal to the difference between the orbits. The wavelength of that light depended on its energy, which explained why atoms emitted light at specific, characteristic wavelengths. The Balmer series and other spectral patterns could be precisely calculated from Bohr's model. Bohr's model was published in 1913 and caused immediate excitement. It explained atomic spectra, it explained atomic stability, and it made predictions that could be tested. Experiments confirmed Bohr's predictions with remarkable precision. Here was a theory that worked, even though it seemed to violate the continuous nature of classical mechanics. But Bohr's model was also deeply puzzling. Why could electrons only occupy certain orbits? What happened during the quantum jump from one orbit to another? How did an electron know which orbit to jump to? These questions pointed towards something even stranger than Bohr had proposed. Over the next decade, other physicists, including Werner Heisenberg, Erwin Schrödinger, Wolfgang Pauli, and Max Born, developed quantum mechanics into a comprehensive theory. Bohr was at the center of these discussions, his Institute for Theoretical Physics in Copenhagen becoming the hub of the quantum revolution. Scientists came from around the world to work with Bohr to discuss the strange implications of quantum theory. The quantum world that emerged from these discussions was profoundly different from the classical world of everyday experience. Particles had wave-like properties. You couldn't know both the position and momentum of a particle with perfect precision. The act of measurement affected what you measured. Particles could exist in superpositions of states until they were observed. Probability was fundamental, not just a reflection of ignorance. Einstein, who had helped launch quantum theory, was troubled by these implications. He and Bohr engaged in a series of profound debates about the nature of reality and the completeness of quantum mechanics. Einstein believed that quantum mechanics must be incomplete, that there must be deeper deterministic laws underlying the probabilistic quantum predictions. Bohr argued that quantum mechanics was complete, that probability and uncertainty were fundamental features of reality, not just limitations of our knowledge. These debates were always conducted with mutual respect and even affection. Einstein would propose thought experiments designed to show contradictions in quantum mechanics. Bohr would spend sleepless nights analyzing the thought experiments, finding the subtle errors or overlooked quantum effects. The debates pushed both men to sharpen their thinking and advanced the understanding of quantum theory. Bohr also developed the principle of complementarity, the idea that certain properties, like wave and particle nature, were complementary aspects of reality that could not be observed simultaneously. Which aspect you observed depended on what kind of measurement you made. This was not a limitation of our measuring instruments, but a fundamental feature of nature. During World War II, Bohr remained in occupied Denmark for as long as he could, but as a half-Jewish scientist who had spoken out against Nazi racial policies, he was in danger. In 1943, he was smuggled out of Denmark to Sweden, and then flown to England in the bomb bay of a military aircraft. He nearly died when his oxygen mask failed to work properly, but he survived and spent the rest of the war in America and England, where he was consulted on the Manhattan Project to develop atomic weapons. Bohr was horrified by the destructive power of nuclear weapons and spent his later years advocating for international cooperation and openness in atomic energy, believing that secrecy and competition would lead to an arms race and potential catastrophe. He argued for what he called an open world, where scientific knowledge would be shared rather than hoarded. Bohr continued working until his death in 1962, still pondering the deep questions about the nature of reality that quantum mechanics raised. His institute in Copenhagen had trained a generation of physicists who spread quantum mechanics throughout the world. His complementarity principle and his interpretation of quantum mechanics, known as the Copenhagen interpretation, remained influential, though still debated. As we rest now, we can imagine Bohr contemplating the atom, visualizing those discrete orbits, those quantum jumps, trying to understand how nature could behave in ways so different from everyday experience. We can picture him in discussion with Einstein, two giants of physics respectfully disagreeing about the nature of reality itself. And we can marvel at how the exploration of the tiniest constituents of matter revealed a world that was strange, probabilistic, and beautiful, where the act of observation mattered, where certainty gave way to possibility, and where nature operated according to rules more subtle than anyone had imagined. Max Planck, the reluctant revolutionary. In Berlin, as the 19th century drew to a close, a theoretical physicist was struggling with a seemingly technical problem about how hot objects emit light. Max Planck was a conservative man, deeply committed to classical physics and its elegant, continuous equations. But the problem wouldn't yield to classical methods. In desperation, Planck tried something radical. He assumed that energy could only be emitted or absorbed in discrete chunks, in quanta. It was meant to be a mathematical trick, a way to get an equation that matched the experimental data. But this simple assumption would shatter the foundations of classical physics and give birth to quantum theory, ushering in a revolution that Planck himself never fully embraced. Planck was born in 1858 in Kiel, Germany, into an academic family with a strong tradition of scholarship and service. His father was a professor of law, and young Max grew up in an atmosphere of intellectual rigor and ethical responsibility. He was an excellent student, talented in music as well as academics, but it was physics that captured his deepest interest. When Planck expressed his intention to study physics, one of his professors discouraged him, saying that physics was essentially complete, that all the fundamental laws had been discovered, and all that remained was to refine measurements and work out minor details. But Planck was not interested in discovering new laws. He was drawn to the beauty and harmony of the existing ones. He wanted to understand deeply, to see how the laws fit together, to find unity and simplicity in nature's workings. Planck specialized in thermodynamics, the study of heat and energy. This was a mature field with well-established laws, and Planck made contributions to understanding entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. But his revolutionary contribution came from investigating what seemed like a straightforward question. How does a perfect absorber and emitter of radiation, what physicists call a black body, radiate energy at different wavelengths when heated to different temperatures? This was not just a theoretical curiosity. The problem had practical implications for incandescent lighting and metallurgy. And there was a crisis. The classical physics predictions didn't match the experimental observations. Classical theory predicted that a heated object should emit infinite energy at short wavelengths, a result so absurd it was called the ultraviolet catastrophe. Planck worked on this problem for years, trying different approaches, always seeking a solution within the framework of classical physics. Nothing worked. Finally, in October 1900, He found an equation that fit the experimental data perfectly. But he had no theoretical justification for it. It was empirical, a formula that worked, but without foundation. Over the next 2 months, Planck struggled to find a theoretical basis for his equation. And then, in what he later called an act of desperation, he made a radical assumption. He supposed that the oscillators in the heated material, the vibrating atoms and molecules, could only emit or absorb energy in discrete amounts in quanta. The energy of a quantum was proportional to the frequency of the radiation, E equals hf, where h was a new constant of nature, now called Planck's constant. With this assumption, Planck could derive his equation from first principles. He announced his result on December 14, 1900, a date often taken as the birth of quantum theory. The constant h that Planck introduced, though tiny in everyday terms, would become one of the most fundamental constants in physics. But Planck himself didn't believe in the physical reality of quanta. He thought of them as a mathematical device, a useful fiction. He spent years trying to find a way to derive his result without the quantum assumption, but he failed. Other physicists, particularly Einstein, took quanta seriously and extended the idea to light itself, proposing that light was composed of discrete particles, photons, each carrying a quantum of energy. Einstein's bold extension of quantum ideas won him the Nobel Prize in 1921 for his explanation of the photoelectric effect, in which light striking a metal surface ejects electrons. The effect could only be explained if light came in discrete packets, each with energy hf, just as Planck's formula suggested. Gradually, the quantum nature of light and matter became undeniable. Planck watched these developments with mixed feelings. He was pleased that his work had proven important, but troubled by the way it was overthrowing the classical physics he loved. As quantum mechanics developed in the 1920s, becoming increasingly abstract and probabilistic, Planck felt increasingly distant from the revolution he had started. Planck's life was marked by both professional success and personal tragedy. He was respected and honored, awarded the Nobel Prize in 1918, becoming president of various scientific societies. But he endured profound sorrows. His first wife died in 1909. His eldest son was killed in World War I. Both his daughters died in childbirth. And in World War II, his youngest son, Erwin, was executed by the Nazis for his involvement in a plot to assassinate Hitler. Planck, elderly and grief-stricken, continued to work and teach, finding solace in science and music. Throughout his life, Planck maintained a deep religious faith. He saw no conflict between science and religion, believing that both sought truth in their own domains. Science, he felt, revealed the order and harmony of the physical world, while religion addressed questions of meaning and value. His ethical convictions kept him in Germany during the Nazi era, though he disagreed with the regime's policies. He tried, unsuccessfully, to protect Jewish scientists and preserve the integrity of German science. Planck died in 1947, having lived through 2 world wars and the complete transformation of physics that his own discovery had initiated. The revolution he had reluctantly started had completely reshaped our understanding of reality. Energy was quantized. Light was both wave and particle. The deterministic clockwork universe of classical physics had given way to the probabilistic quantum world. As we rest now, we can imagine Planck at his desk, working through his calculations, trying every classical approach, and finally, desperately, introducing quanta just to make the mathematics work. We can picture his surprise when the equation fit the data perfectly, and then his years-long struggle to understand what he had discovered. And we can appreciate the irony that sometimes the greatest revolutions are started by conservatives by people who push the existing framework as far as it will go until it breaks and reveals something entirely new beneath. Albert Einstein, reimagining everything. In a patent office in Bern, Switzerland, a young clerk was spending his days evaluating technical applications for new inventions. But in his spare time, in the evenings and on weekends, he was thinking about the deepest questions in physics. Albert Einstein, just 26 years old in 1905, was about to publish 4 papers that would transform our understanding of light, matter, space, and time. And a decade later, he would complete his greatest work, the general theory of relativity, which reimagined gravity not as a force, but as the curvature of space-time itself. Einstein was born in 1879 in Ulm, Germany, into a secular Jewish family. His father and uncle ran an electrical engineering business, and young Albert grew up around electrical devices and technical discussions. He was a curious child, fascinated by a compass his father showed him, wondering what invisible force made the needle always point north. He was also independent-minded, sometimes clashing with the rigid, authoritarian teaching methods common in German schools. Einstein excelled in mathematics and physics, but struggled with rote learning and arbitrary authority. He eventually left school without graduating, but later passed entrance exams for the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich. There he studied physics and mathematics, though he often skipped lectures to study on his own or to pursue his own interests. His professors were not always impressed. One called him a lazy dog. After graduating, Einstein struggled to find an academic position. He took temporary teaching jobs, tutored students, and eventually secured a position at the Swiss Patent Office. It was not the career he had hoped for, but it provided steady income and left him time for his own research. And in that modest position, he produced miracles. In 1905, Einstein's Annus Mirabilis, or Miraculous Year, he published 4 papers, each of which would have been sufficient to secure his place in scientific history. The first explained the photoelectric effect using quantum ideas, proposing that light was composed of discrete particles, photons. This work won him the Nobel Prize and helped establish quantum theory. The second paper provided convincing evidence for the existence of atoms by analyzing Brownian motion, the random jiggling of particles suspended in a fluid. He showed that this motion was caused by collisions with individual molecules, and he derived equations that allowed the size and number of molecules to be calculated. This finally convinced the last skeptics that atoms were real. The third and fourth papers introduced special relativity, a complete reconception of space and time. Einstein had been puzzled by an asymmetry in electromagnetic theory and by the failure of experiments to detect Earth's motion through the hypothetical ether that was supposed to carry light waves. His solution was radical. The speed of light is constant for all observers, regardless of their motion. This simple postulate, combined with the principle that the laws of physics should be the same for all observers moving at constant velocity, led to extraordinary consequences. Time was not absolute. 2 events that were simultaneous for one observer might not be simultaneous for another observer moving at a different velocity. Time dilated, moving clocks ran slower. Space contracted, moving objects shortened in their direction of motion. Mass and energy were equivalent, related by the famous equation E = mc². A small amount of mass could be converted into an enormous amount of energy. These results seemed impossible, contrary to all common sense. But they flowed inevitably from Einstein's simple postulates, and every experimental test confirmed them. Special relativity worked. But Einstein was not satisfied. Special relativity applied only to observers moving at constant velocity. What about accelerated motion? And what about gravity? Newton's law of gravitation was instantaneous, with gravitational force acting across space without delay. But special relativity said nothing could travel faster than light. There was a contradiction. For the next 10 years, Einstein worked on extending relativity to include acceleration and gravity. It was the most difficult intellectual challenge he ever faced. The mathematics was complex, requiring geometrical concepts that Einstein had to learn from mathematicians. The physical ideas were subtle, requiring new ways of thinking about space and time. Einstein's key insight was the equivalence principle. Being in a gravitational field is indistinguishable from being in an accelerated reference frame. If you're in an elevator accelerating upward, you feel pressed to the floor exactly as if gravity had increased. If the elevator were in free fall, you would feel weightless, as if gravity had vanished. Einstein realized that gravity and acceleration were two aspects of the same phenomenon. This led him to a revolutionary idea. Gravity is not a force at all, but rather the curvature of spacetime. Massive objects like the sun curve the spacetime around them, and other objects moving through that curved spacetime follow curved paths, which we perceive as gravitational attraction. The moon orbits Earth not because a force pulls on it, but because it's following the straightest possible path through the curved spacetime around Earth. Einstein's field equations of general relativity, published in 1915, described precisely how matter and energy curve spacetime, and how that curvature determines the motion of matter and energy. The equations were beautiful, but fiendishly difficult to solve. Even Einstein could only find exact solutions for the simplest cases. But those simple cases led to testable predictions. Light traveling past the sun should be deflected by the sun's gravitational field, or more accurately, by the curvature of spacetime near the sun. The orbit of Mercury, the planet closest to the sun, should precess slightly, shifting over time in a way that Newton's theory couldn't quite account for. Time should run slower in stronger gravitational fields. The prediction about light deflection was tested during a solar eclipse in 1919. Arthur Eddington led expeditions to observe stars near the sun during the eclipse, when they could be seen. The starlight was indeed deflected by precisely the amount Einstein's theory predicted. When the results were announced, Einstein became world famous overnight. Newspapers proclaimed that Newton had been overthrown, that space was curved, that reality was stranger than anyone had imagined. General relativity also predicted even stranger phenomena. It allowed for the possibility of black holes, regions of spacetime so warped that nothing, not even light, could escape. It predicted gravitational waves, ripples in spacetime itself that would propagate at the speed of light. It suggested that the universe as a whole might be expanding or contracting. Einstein spent his later years trying to unify gravity and electromagnetism into a single theory, but he never succeeded. He was also uncomfortable with the probabilistic interpretation of quantum mechanics that had developed in the 1920s, feeling that God does not play dice with the universe. He engaged in famous debates with Niels Bohr, proposing thought experiments designed to show that quantum mechanics was incomplete. But the quantum theory withstood every challenge. Einstein emigrated to the United States in 1933, fleeing the rise of Nazism in Germany. He spent his remaining years at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He became an iconic figure, with his wild hair and thoughtful eyes, a symbol of genius and creativity. He used his fame to advocate for peace, for civil rights, and for international cooperation. When Einstein died in 1955, he left behind a transformed understanding of reality. Space and time were not fixed background stages, but were dynamic, flexible, interwoven into spacetime. Mass and energy were equivalent. Gravity was geometry. The universe had a structure and history that could be studied scientifically. As we rest now, we can imagine young Einstein in the patent office, pondering what it would be like to ride alongside a beam of light, trying to picture the nature of space and time. We can visualize space-time curved around massive objects, with planets following the contours of that curvature like marbles rolling on a stretched rubber sheet. And we can marvel at how one person's thought, one person's willingness to question the most basic assumptions about reality, could reveal a universe stranger and more beautiful than anyone had imagined. The atom had been shattered, revealing a nucleus. The nucleus had been probed, revealing quantum mysteries. Space and time had been unified and curved. And through it all, patient observation, mathematical precision, and bold imagination had shown that reality, at every scale, was far more wonderful than common sense suggested. The Code of Life and the Age of Information. Rosalind Franklin, the hidden structure revealed. In a basement laboratory at King's College London, a young chemist was working with X-rays, directing them through tiny fibers of a mysterious substance extracted from cells. Rosalind Franklin was a meticulous experimentalist, patient and precise, and she was attempting to photograph the structure of DNA, the molecule that somehow carried the instructions for building and maintaining living organisms. Her images would be among the most important photographs ever taken, revealing the elegant double helix that held the secret of heredity. Yet her crucial contribution would be overlooked in her lifetime, recognized only years after her untimely death. Franklin was born in 1920 in London, into a prominent Jewish family. From an early age, she showed exceptional talent in science and mathematics. Her family was accomplished and intellectual, and while they supported education, they initially questioned whether such intense scientific work was appropriate for a woman. But Rosalind was determined. She excelled at Cambridge University, graduating in 1941 in the midst of World War II. After Cambridge, Franklin worked on the physical chemistry of coal, research that contributed to the war effort by helping improve gas masks. She developed expertise in X-ray crystallography, a technique that uses the way X-rays scatter when passing through crystalline materials to deduce the arrangement of atoms. It was painstaking work requiring mathematical analysis and careful interpretation, but it could reveal structures at the atomic level. After the war, Franklin went to Paris to work at a government laboratory, where she refined her crystallographic skills and flourished in the collegial French research environment. She learned to extract the maximum information from X-ray diffraction patterns, developing new techniques for analyzing data. She was happy in Paris, but in 1951, she accepted a fellowship to return to London to work at King's College. Franklin's assignment was to use X-ray crystallography to study DNA. By this time, scientists knew that DNA carried genetic information, but they didn't know its structure. How could a molecule encode the vast amount of information needed to build and maintain an organism? How could it copy itself so that information could be passed from parent to offspring? The structure would surely provide clues. DNA was difficult to work with. The molecules were large and fragile, hard to crystallize. But Franklin was a superb experimentalist. She prepared exceptionally pure DNA samples and controlled the humidity carefully, discovering that DNA could exist in different forms depending on water content. The form she called B-form DNA, which existed at higher humidity, was more regular and would yield clearer diffraction patterns. In May 1952, Franklin produced what came to be called Photo 51, an X-ray diffraction image of B-form DNA that was strikingly clear. The pattern showed an X shape, a telltale sign of a helical structure. From this image and her careful measurements, Franklin concluded that DNA was a helix with the sugar phosphate backbone on the outside and the bases on the inside. She calculated the dimensions. The helix made a complete turn every 34 angstroms, with 10 base pairs per turn. But Franklin was cautious. She wanted to be certain before publishing. She knew that X-ray data could be ambiguous, that patterns could be misinterpreted. She continued her work, gathering more data, checking her conclusions. Meanwhile, at Cambridge, James Watson and Francis Crick were also working on the structure of DNA, though they were building theoretical models rather than generating experimental data. They had access to some of Franklin's data, shown to them without her knowledge by her colleague Maurice Wilkins, with whom she had a difficult working relationship. When Watson saw photo 51, he immediately recognized its significance. The helical structure was clear. In February 1953, Watson and Crick combined Franklin's experimental data with Linus Pauling's insights about chemical bonding and the work of Erwin Chargaff, who had discovered that DNA always contained equal amounts of adenine and thymine, and equal amounts of guanine and cytosine. They built a model, a double helix with 2 sugar phosphate backbones spiraling on the outside and the bases paired on the inside, A always with T, G always with C, held together by hydrogen bonds. The structure was beautiful and immediately suggested how DNA could replicate. The 2 strands could separate, and each strand could serve as a template for building a new complementary strand. The sequence of bases along the strand could encode information, with different sequences specifying different instructions. Watson and Crick published their model in the journal Nature in April 1953. Franklin published her experimental data, supporting the double helix structure in the same issue. But the way the story was told gave primary credit to Watson and Crick for the discovery, with Franklin's crucial experimental evidence treated as supporting detail. Franklin did not pursue the matter. She had already moved to Birkbeck College to work on the structure of viruses, using X-ray crystallography to reveal how these infectious particles were organized. She made important discoveries about the tobacco mosaic virus, showing its helical structure. She was happy in this work, productive and respected. But in 1956, Franklin was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. She continued working through treatments, determined to finish her research. She died in April 1958, at just 37 years old, likely a victim of the radiation exposure from years of X-ray work at a time when safety precautions were inadequate. 4 years later, in 1962, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to Watson, Crick, and Wilkins for the discovery of the structure of DNA. Franklin, who had died, was not eligible for the prize, which is not awarded posthumously. Her crucial contribution was barely mentioned. In later years, as historians examined the archives, and as Watson published his own account of the discovery, Franklin's role became clear. Photo 51 had been critical. Her experimental data had been essential. Her caution and precision had been scientific virtues, not weaknesses. The full story emerged. A brilliant experimentalist whose work had been used without proper acknowledgement, whose contribution had been minimized, who had been denied credit during her lifetime. Today, Franklin is recognized as a pioneer of molecular biology. Schools, buildings, and awards are named in her honor. Her story has become a symbol of the obstacles faced by women in science and the importance of recognizing all contributors to scientific discovery. The structure of DNA that Franklin helped reveal transformed biology. It explained heredity at the molecular level showing how genetic information was stored and transmitted. It opened the door to genetic engineering, to understanding diseases at their molecular roots, to the entire field of molecular biology. The code of life had been cracked, and Rosalind Franklin's precise experimental work had been essential to that achievement. As we rest now, we can imagine Franklin in her darkroom, developing Photo 51, watching the X-shape emerge on the film, knowing she was seeing something profound but being cautious, wanting to be absolutely certain. We can picture her at her lab bench, preparing samples with care, adjusting the humidity, taking measurement after measurement. And we can honor her memory, recognizing that science advances through the contributions of many people, and that every careful experiment, every precise measurement, every patient accumulation of evidence brings us closer to understanding nature's deepest patterns. Marie Curie, radiance and determination. In a cold, drafty shed in Paris, a couple worked late into the night, boiling down tons of a black or called pitchblende, trying to isolate mysterious substances that emitted invisible rays. Marie and Pierre Curie were pursuing radioactivity, the phenomenon Henri Becquerel had discovered just a few years before. Marie suspected that the rays came from atoms themselves, not from some chemical reaction, and she believed that other elements beyond uranium might be radioactive. She would discover two new elements, radium and polonium, would win 2 Nobel Prizes, and would pioneer the use of radioactivity in medicine. But her dedication to her work would come at a cost, as the very radiation she studied would eventually take her life. Marie Curie was born Maria Sklodowska in 1867 in Warsaw, Poland, which was then part of the Russian Empire. Her parents were teachers, and though the family was not wealthy, they valued education deeply. Poland was occupied and oppressed, its language and culture suppressed, and young Maria absorbed a fierce patriotism and determination to prove herself. She excelled in school, but faced a difficult obstacle. Universities in Poland did not admit women. Maria worked as a governess to save money and to help support her older sister Bronia's medical studies in Paris. The sisters had an agreement. Bronia would study first, and then once established, would help Maria come to Paris to study. In 1891, Maria finally made it to Paris, enrolling at the Sorbonne to study physics and mathematics. She lived in a tiny, unheated garret, often going hungry to save money, but she was intensely happy, free to study and surrounded by learning. She graduated at the top of her class in physics and earned a second degree in mathematics. Through a colleague, Maria met Pierre Curie, a physicist who had already made important discoveries about crystalline structure and magnetism. They found they shared a deep commitment to science and a similar intensity of purpose. They married in 1895, and their partnership would be both romantic and scientific, one of the most productive collaborations in the history of science. When Marie was searching for a topic for her doctoral research, she chose to investigate Becquerel's mysterious rays. Why did uranium emit these rays? Did other substances emit them? She set up simple experiments using an electrometer that Pierre and his brother had designed, and she systematically tested various elements and compounds. She made several key discoveries. The intensity of the radiation depended only on the amount of uranium present, not on its chemical form or environmental conditions. This suggested that the rays came from the uranium atoms themselves, not from any chemical reaction. She tested other elements and found that thorium was also radioactive, a term she coined to describe this property. But the most intriguing finding came from testing pitchblende, the ore from which uranium was extracted. Pitchblende was more radioactive than pure uranium, more radioactive than it should be based on its uranium content. Marie concluded that pitchblende must contain other, unknown radioactive elements, elements even more radioactive than uranium. Pierre was so intrigued by Marie's results that he set aside his own research to work with her. Together, they began the monumental task of isolating these unknown elements from pitchblende. They obtained tons of pitchblende residues from a mining company and began a laborious process of chemical separation. They boiled, filtered, precipitated, and crystallized over and over, following the radioactivity, concentrating whatever was causing it. The work was done in a leaky shed that had once been a dissecting room at the School of Physics. In summer it was stifling hot, in winter freezing. The large vats of boiling material filled the shed with fumes. Marie would stir the boiling mass with an iron rod nearly as tall as she was. It was physically exhausting, but she found it exhilarating. At night, they would sometimes return to the shed to see their solutions glowing with a faint, ghostly blue light, the radiance of the radioactive elements they were isolating. In 1898, they announced the discovery of two new elements. One they named polonium, after Marie's beloved homeland. The other they named radium, from the Latin word for ray. Radium was intensely radioactive, millions of times more so than uranium. It took 4 more years of grinding work, processing literally tons of pitchblende, before they isolated a tiny sample of pure radium that could be weighed and studied. In 1903, Marie, Pierre, and Henri Becquerel were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for their work on radioactivity. Marie was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. The recognition brought fame, but also financial security, and the Curies could finally afford a better laboratory and equipment. Marie completed her doctorate, becoming the first woman in France to earn a PhD in physics. Tragedy struck in 1906 when Pierre was killed in a street accident, run over by a horse-drawn wagon on a rainy Paris evening. Marie was devastated, but she channeled her grief into work. She was appointed to Pierre's professorship at the Sorbonne, becoming the first woman professor there. She continued her research on radium and radioactivity. In 1911, Marie was awarded a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry, for her discovery and isolation of radium and polonium. She remains the only person to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences, and one of only a few people to win twice. Marie also pioneered the medical use of radioactivity. She recognized that radiation could destroy diseased tissue, and she worked to develop techniques for using radium in cancer treatment. During World War I, she organized mobile X-ray units to help surgeons locate bullets and shrapnel in wounded soldiers. She drove to the front lines herself, accompanied sometimes by her daughter Arin, bringing X-ray equipment to field hospitals. These petites Curies, as the mobile units were called, saved countless lives. But the radiation that Marie worked with for decades was damaging her health. In the early years, no one understood the dangers. Marie would carry test tubes of radioactive material in her pockets, was delighted by the glow of radium compounds, worked without any protection from the radiation. The notebooks she used in her experiments are still radioactive today, too dangerous to handle without protection. By the 1920s, Marie's health was declining. She suffered from cataracts and from anemia, conditions likely caused by radiation exposure. In 1934, she died from aplastic anemia, a disease affecting the bone marrow, almost certainly a result of years of exposure to radiation. Marie Curie's legacy is immense. She opened up the study of radioactivity, revealing that atoms were not indivisible and unchangeable as had been thought, but could transform, releasing energy. Her work led to the understanding of atomic structure, to the development of nuclear physics, and to countless applications in medicine and industry. She showed that women could not only participate in science, but could lead, could make fundamental discoveries, could achieve the highest recognition. Her daughter Erin would follow in her footsteps, winning her own Nobel Prize in chemistry with her husband for the discovery of artificial radioactivity. The Curie name became synonymous with scientific excellence, with dedication, with the pursuit of knowledge no matter the obstacles. As we rest now, we can imagine Marie in that cold shed, stirring her cauldron of pitchblende, watching for the telltale signs of radioactivity, driven by curiosity and determination. We can picture her joy when she first saw that faint blue glow, knowing that she was seeing something new, something no one had seen before. And we can appreciate her courage, working in difficult conditions, overcoming prejudice, pursuing her passion for science with single-minded dedication. She illuminated the path forward, literally and figuratively, showing that nature still held profound secrets, and that the courage to seek them could change the world. Ada Lovelace, the prophet of the computer age. In a grand house in London in the 1840s, a young woman was studying a remarkable machine, a proposed analytical engine, designed by the mathematician Charles Babbage. Ada Lovelace, daughter of the poet Lord Byron, was translating a description of this machine from French to English, but she went far beyond translation. In her notes, she described how such a machine could be programmed, how it could manipulate not just numbers, but any symbols, how it might one day compose music or create art. She wrote what is considered the first computer program, a century before electronic computers would exist. She saw the potential of the information age before anyone else, a prophet of computing in an age of steam and coal. Ada was born in 1815, the only legitimate child of Lord Byron, the famous Romantic poet. Her parents' marriage was troubled, and they separated when Ada was just a month old. Byron left England and never saw his daughter again, dying when she was 8. Ada's mother, Annabella, was determined that Ada would not inherit what she saw as her father's dangerous poetic temperament. She insisted on a rigorous education in mathematics and science, unusual for any child of the time, almost unheard of for a girl. Ada proved to have a remarkable mind, fascinated by mathematics and by machines. As a girl, she became interested in the possibility of flight and studied bird anatomy, designing wings based on her observations. She called it flyology. Her mind was both creative and analytical, able to imagine possibilities and to work through the mathematical details that might make them real. When Ada was 17, she was introduced to Charles Babbage, a mathematician and inventor who had designed a calculating machine called the difference engine. Babbage was working on an even more ambitious project, the analytical engine, a mechanical computer that could perform any calculation by following a program of instructions stored on punched cards, like those used in weaving looms to create patterns in fabric. Ada was fascinated by Babbage's vision. She understood immediately that the analytical engine was more than just a calculator. It was a general-purpose machine, something fundamentally new. She and Babbage became friends and correspondents, and she studied his designs carefully, asking questions, making suggestions, thinking through the implications. In 1842, an Italian mathematician published a description of the analytical engine in French. Babbage asked Ada to translate it into English. She agreed, but her translation grew into something much more substantial. She added her own notes, which ended up being 3 times longer than the original article. These notes contained insights that were decades, even a century, ahead of their time. In her notes, Ada described how the analytical engine could be programmed using punched cards to instruct the machine in a sequence of operations. She included what is now recognized as the first computer program, a detailed set of instructions for calculating Bernoulli numbers, a complex mathematical sequence. She worked through the algorithm step by step, showing exactly how the machine would process the instructions. But Ada's vision went much further. She realized that the analytical engine wasn't limited to numbers. It could manipulate any symbols according to rules. If you could represent music as symbols, the machine might compose. If you could represent art as patterns, the machine might create. She wrote, "The analytical engine might act upon other things besides number, were objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract science of operations. Supposing, for instance, that the fundamental relations of pitched sounds in the science of harmony and of musical composition were susceptible of such expression and adaptations, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent." This was an astonishing leap of imagination. Ada saw that computing was not about numbers, but about information, about symbols and their relationships. She glimpsed the essence of what we now call software, the idea that the same hardware could perform vastly different tasks depending on its programming. She even anticipated the modern distinction between hardware and software, between the physical machine and the abstract instructions it followed. Ada also wrestled with the question of whether such a machine could truly think, could be creative. She was skeptical, writing that the analytical engine has no pretensions whatever to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform. This statement, often called Lady Lovelace's objection, continues to be debated in discussions of artificial intelligence. Can machines only follow their programming, or can they genuinely create something new? Tragically, Ada's life was short. She married William King, who later became the Earl of Lovelace, making her Ada, Countess of Lovelace. She had 3 children and tried to balance her intellectual pursuits with her duties as a wife and mother in Victorian society. She corresponded with scientists and mathematicians, continued to study advanced mathematics, and pursued various intellectual projects. But Ada struggled with illness throughout her adult life. She may have inherited a tendency toward the mood swings and creative intensity that had characterized her father. She became interested in horse racing and developed a gambling system that she was convinced was mathematical sound, but it led to debts and difficulties. She was prescribed opiate painkillers for various ailments and may have become dependent on them. In 1852, Ada died of uterine cancer at the age of 36, the same age at which her father had died. She was buried next to the father she had never known, the poet and the programmer lying side by side. The analytical engine that had inspired Ada's visions was never built. Babbage worked on it for decades, but lacked the funding and the manufacturing precision needed to construct such a complex mechanical device. His designs were largely forgotten. But in the 20th century, as electronic computers were being developed, engineers and historians rediscovered Babbage's designs and Ada's notes. They recognized that Ada had understood the fundamental principles of computing. The idea of a stored program, the concept of the algorithm, the distinction between hardware and software, the potential for machines to manipulate any kind of information. Ada Lovelace is now recognized as the first computer programmer, and her insights are seen as foundational to the field of computer science. The U.S. Department of Defense named a programming language, Ada, in her honor. She has become a symbol of women's contributions to technology and an inspiration for those who work at the intersection of creativity and computation. As we rest now, we can imagine Ada in her study, surrounded by papers covered with mathematical notation, thinking through the steps of her algorithm, seeing in her mind's eye how the analytical engine would process each instruction. We can picture her excitement as she realized that the machine could be more than a calculator, that it could manipulate any symbols, could be the foundation of something entirely new. And we can appreciate how her vision, though unrealized in her lifetime, pointed toward the future we now inhabit, a world where information flows through digital machines, where algorithms shape our lives, where the boundary between calculation and creation continues to blur. From the printing press that spread knowledge, to the classification that organized nature, to the laws that explain the heavens, to the forces that powered civilization, to the codes that revealed the mechanisms of life, to the machines that process information, the journey of science had brought humanity to the threshold of a new age, an age where information itself would become the currency of understanding, where patterns hidden in data would reveal new truths, and where the human mind, augmented by its own creations, would continue to push back the boundaries of the unknown. And so we come to rest, having traveled through centuries of discovery, having walked beside those patient observers and bold thinkers who revealed the patterns beneath the surface of things. From Gutenberg's press to Lovelace's algorithm, from Darwin's finches to Franklin's X-rays, each mind built upon the work of those before, each discovery opening new questions, each answer revealing deeper mysteries. The story of science is the story of human curiosity, of our refusal to accept that the world is unknowable, our insistence that nature speaks a language we can learn. It is a story of patience and precision, of courage and creativity, of failures that taught as much as successes, of lone geniuses and collaborative teams, of lucky accidents and decades of painstaking work. As we drift towards sleep, we can feel grateful for these gifts of understanding, for the light that has been shed on the darkness of ignorance, for the tools and knowledge that improve our lives, for the simple beauty of comprehending how things work. The universe is vast and strange and wonderful, and we are privileged to live in a time when so much has been revealed. Rest now, knowing that the work continues, that others are even now peering through microscopes and telescopes, running experiments and checking calculations, asking questions and seeking answers, building on the foundation these remarkable people laid. The story of discovery has no ending, only the peaceful pause between chapters, the quiet moment when we reflect on how far we've come and dream of what we might yet learn. Sleep well.